Before we dive in, it's important to set the tone. What you are about to hear is not a routine celebrity anecdote, not a light-hearted talk, show moment clipped for laughs or applause. This is a dramatized narrative exploring how public figures, immense pressure, and fragile human relationships can collide in unexpected and unsettling ways. It is a story about perception, power, and the moment when admiration gives way to confrontation. What happens when one of Hollywood's most beloved figures, a man who has spent decades transforming personal tragedy into a source of hope for millions, sits down for what should be a familiar, comfortable interview, only to find himself unexpectedly challenged by someone he once trusted? What unfolds is not merely an awkward exchange, but a symbolic rupture that forces an audience to confront uncomfortable questions about celebrity culture, advocacy, and the limits of public decency. This is the moment that changed everything. This is the interview that, in this dramatized account, went catastrophically wrong. And this is the confrontation that pushed even America's most gentle icon to the edge of his composure. The morning began with promise at the studios of The View in New York City. Outside, Manhattan was already alive with its usual rhythm: honking taxis, hurried footsteps, and the low, constant hum of a city that never pauses. Inside the studio, sunlight streamed through the iconic windows, spilling across the polished floor and casting a warm, golden glow over the familiar set. It was the kind of morning producers hope for: smooth, upbeat, and full of anticipation. Production assistants moved with practiced efficiency, adjusting camera angles, checking lighting rigs, and testing microphones. Their routines were automatic by now, refined through hundreds of broadcasts. The atmosphere backstage was relaxed but energized. Michael J. Fox was scheduled to appear, and that always brought a special kind of excitement. His presence had a way of lifting the mood, not just because of his fame, but because of what he represented. For decades, Michael J. Fox had occupied a rare space in the public imagination. He was not just a movie star or a television icon. He was a symbol of resilience. After years of living openly with Parkinson's disease, he had transformed vulnerability into advocacy, raising billions for research and offering hope to patients and families around the world. His story was one of dignity, humor, and quiet strength. In an industry known for scandals and self-destruction, he remained almost universally admired. The studio audience filed in with visible enthusiasm. Many had grown up watching his films, quoting his lines, and following his journey from sitcom stardom to blockbuster fame. Others carried more personal connections. Some lived with Parkinson's themselves. Some cared for parents, spouses, or siblings battling the disease. For them, Michael wasn't just an actor. He was proof that life, meaning, and purpose didn't end with diagnosis. Backstage, makeup artists worked quickly, applying final touches as Michael sat calmly, reviewing notes with his publicist. The conversation was familiar and reassuring. He planned to talk about his foundation's latest research initiatives, highlight promising scientific developments, and promote his new memoir. He hoped to share stories of patients whose lives had been improved by emerging treatments, stories that reminded people why the fight mattered. There was no sense of impending conflict, no warning signs. This was supposed to be safe ground. On set, the hosts prepared as they always did, shuffling cue cards and exchanging light banter. The show thrived on conversation, sometimes heated, sometimes heartfelt, but always framed as dialogue. The cameras rolled. Applause filled the studio. Michael stepped onto the stage, smiling warmly as the audience rose to their feet. What followed in this fictionalized retelling was not immediate or explosive. It began subtly, a question delivered with an edge, a comment that landed just slightly off key. The tone shifted in ways that were almost imperceptible at first, like a hairline crack forming beneath a polished surface. As the discussion moved away from research and hope toward more charged territory, tension crept into the room. Michael listened, as he always did, with patience and grace. He answered thoughtfully, choosing words carefully, aware of the millions watching at home. But as the exchange continued, the framing changed, the warmth faded. The conversation took on a sharper, more confrontational edge, one that, in this dramatized narrative, felt personal rather than professional. The audience sensed it. You could feel the shift in the air. Applause grew hesitant, laughter faded. The hosts exchanged glances. This was no longer just another interview. In this imagined moment, Michael found himself not merely defending ideas, but defending intent, his life's work, his advocacy, his character. For someone who had spent decades being open, vulnerable, and earnest, the implication of insincerity cut deeply. It was no longer about policy or perspective, it was about respect. And then came the breaking point, not a raised voice or a dramatic outburst, but something quieter and more powerful, a pause, a look. A measured response that carried the weight of years lived under scrutiny. In that moment, the audience didn't see a movie star. They saw a human being setting a boundary. The interview ended, the cameras cut. But the impact lingered. In this fictional account, the fallout spread quickly. Clips circulated. Headlines followed. Viewers debated what they had seen and what it meant. Some saw confrontation. Others saw misunderstanding. Many saw a reflection of something larger, how easily empathy can be overshadowed by ego, and how even spaces built for conversation can become arenas for conflict. This story, though dramatized, serves as a reminder. Public kindness should never be mistaken for weakness, and advocacy is not an invitation for attack. There are lines that, once crossed, cannot be uncrossed, not because of fame, but because of basic human decency. For Michael, this interview was supposed to be familiar territory, the kind he had done countless times before. Over the years, he had sat under bright studio lights and answered difficult questions with grace, humor, and an optimism that had become inseparable from his public image. Interviews like this were never about ego for him. They were about awareness, about progress, about reminding people that hope was not naive. It was necessary. What neither Michael nor most of the people inside the studio realized that morning was that something was different. Whoopi Goldberg had arrived at work in a peculiar mood. It wasn't loud or explosive. It was quieter than that, more unsettling. Those who worked closely with her might have noticed the signs if they were paying attention. The tight line of her jaw, the distracted way her eyes lingered on the page instead of the room, the intensity with which she reviewed her notes as if preparing for a confrontation rather than conversation. Most people brushed it off. The view was built on strong opinions and passionate debates. A serious mood wasn't unusual. It was just another day, or so everyone assumed. When Michael finally made his entrance, the audience erupted in applause. The sound filled the studio, warm and genuine, rolling over him like a wave. He moved carefully but confidently across the set, that familiar smile lighting up his face as he waved to the crowd. His movements carried the subtle tremors that had become part of his public reality. Not hidden, not dramatized, simply present. He had long ago stopped trying to disguise them. They were a part of him, and he had made peace with that. The co-hosts stood to greet him, their reactions immediate and sincere. Joy Behar beamed as she shook his hand. Sunny Hostin smiled broadly, her enthusiasm unmistakable. Sarah Haynes looked genuinely delighted to see him, and Alyssa Farrah Griffin nodded with clear admiration. The moment felt warm, respectful, and exactly as expected. Everyone appeared happy to have Michael there. Everyone except Whoopi. She barely looked up from her notes as Michael settled into the guest chair. Her acknowledgement was brief, almost mechanical, no smile, no warmth, just a quick glance before her eyes returned to the page in front of her. The other hosts exchanged subtle glances, quick enough that most viewers wouldn't notice, but telling to those who did. Something was off. Those who had worked alongside Whoopi for years recognized the shift immediately. This wasn't her usual pre-show focus or intensity. This was something colder, sharper, something deliberate. Michael adjusted his microphone, still smiling toward the audience, seemingly unaware that the tone of the room had quietly shifted beneath him. The cameras rolled. The red lights blinked on. "So, Michael," Whoopi began, skipping any warm introduction. Her voice carried an edge that sliced through the atmosphere like a blade through silk. "You're here to talk about your foundation work, but I have to ask, don't you think it's a bit convenient how you always seem to show up right when you need public sympathy?" The words landed heavily, hanging in the air like a grenade that hadn't yet exploded. The studio fell silent, completely, unnervingly silent. Audience members who had been smiling just moments earlier froze in their seats, unsure whether they had heard correctly. A few heads turned, a few mouths fell open. The other hosts stiffened instantly, surprise etched across their faces. Michael's smile faltered. Just for a second. The cameras caught the confusion as it flickered across his features before he recovered with practiced composure. "I'm sorry, Whoopi," he said carefully, his voice still calm but now guarded. "I'm not sure I understand what you mean by that." Whoopi leaned forward in her chair. The aggression in her posture was unmistakable now. Gone was the casual talk, show rhythm. This was something else entirely. "Come on, Michael," she pressed. "Every time your career needs a boost, every time you have something to promote, suddenly we're all reminded about your condition. It's almost like you're using it as a crutch." The temperature in the studio seemed to drop instantly. Several audience members gasped audibly. One woman brought a hand to her mouth. Camera operators exchanged stunned glances, their training telling them to keep filming, while their instincts screamed that something had gone terribly wrong. In the control room, producers were almost certainly scrambling, hands hovering over buttons, voices overlapping through headset, trying to determine whether this was some kind of planned provocation or an unthinkable breach of boundaries happening live on air. Michael sat very still. For a man who had spent decades turning vulnerability into strength, the accusation cut deep, not because it was loud, but because it questioned the sincerity of his life's work. The room waited. Even the hum of studio equipment seemed to fade. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady, but quieter. "I've never asked anyone for sympathy," he said. "What I've asked for is understanding and awareness. If sharing my reality helps someone else feel less alone, then I'll keep doing it." The audience erupted, not in cheers, but in something heavier. Supportive, protective, Whoopi didn't lean back. "Well, maybe some people feel you've crossed the line between advocacy and exploitation," she replied. The other hosts shifted uncomfortably. One tried to interject. Another attempted to redirect the conversation, but the damage was already done. The warmth that had filled the studio moments earlier was gone, replaced by a tension so thick it felt almost visible. Michael nodded slowly, absorbing the moment. When he spoke again, there was no anger in his voice, only resolve. "I've lived with this disease every day for decades," he said. "If telling that truth makes anyone uncomfortable, that's something they'll have to sit with. I already have." Silence followed. The cameras kept rolling, but something fundamental had changed. What was meant to be an interview had become a line-crossing confrontation, one that would linger long after the broadcast ended. And in that moment, the audience didn't see a celebrity. They saw a man choosing dignity over retaliation. Here is an expanded version of your paragraph, rewritten and developed into approximately 1,000 words in English, while keeping the same tone, tension, and dramatic arc. I've treated it as a fictionalized narrative scene, deepening the emotions, pacing, and atmosphere without changing the core events. For him, it was supposed to be familiar territory, the kind of interview he had done countless times before over the years. A well-lit studio, a welcoming audience, friendly questions, and a conversation shaped by warmth and mutual respect. He had learned long ago how to navigate these spaces with grace, how to let his trademark humor soften difficult moments, how to project optimism even when his body resisted him. That optimism had become part of his public identity, as recognizable as his smile, as expected as his honesty. To most viewers, he was a symbol of resilience, a man who had faced adversity and chosen to meet it with courage and dignity. What neither Michael nor anyone else watching at home knew was that Whoopi Goldberg had arrived at the studio that morning in a peculiar and unmistakable mood. Those who worked closely with her, the producers, the assistants, the co-hosts who shared the table with her day after day, I'd have recognized the subtle warning signs. There was the tightness in her jaw, barely visible but persistent. The way her eyes skimmed over her notes not with curiosity, but with intensity, as though she were rehearsing something sharp-edged in her mind. She was quieter than usual before the cameras rolled, less inclined toward casual banter. When she did speak, her tone lacked its usual warmth. Still, most people brushed it off. After all, this was The View, a place built on passionate discussions, strong opinions, and occasional sparks. A little tension was practically part of the show's DNA. When Michael finally made his entrance, the atmosphere shifted instantly. The audience erupted into applause, a wave of affection rolling toward him as he stepped onto the set. He moved carefully but confidently, crossing the stage with practiced ease. His familiar smile lit up his face as he waved to the crowd, acknowledging their support. His movements carried the subtle tremors that had become part of his public reality, neither hidden nor exaggerated, simply present. It was a truth he no longer tried to disguise, nor did he allow it to define him entirely. It was just part of who he was. The other co-hosts stood to greet him, their warmth unmistakable. Joy Behar beamed as she shook his hand, leaning in with genuine enthusiasm. Sunny Hostin smiled broadly, her expression open and welcoming. Sarah Haynes looked genuinely delighted, almost honored, to have him there. Alyssa Farrah Griffin nodded with energetic approval. The moment felt exactly as it should have, respectful, appreciative, human. Everyone seemed happy to have Michael on the show. Everyone except Whoopi. She barely looked up from her notes as he settled into the guest chair. Her acknowledgment, when it came, was brief and perfunctory, stripped of the warmth that usually defined her presence. The other hosts noticed immediately. They exchanged quick glances, subtle, fleeting, but telling. Something was off. This wasn't Whoopi's usual pre-interview focus. This wasn't distraction or fatigue. This felt deliberate, cold, calculated. Michael adjusted his microphone, still smiling at the audience, seemingly unaware that the tone of the conversation had already been set, that an invisible line had already been drawn. The cameras settled into place, the red lights blinked on. So, Michael, Whoopi began, without preamble. Her voice carried an edge that sliced through the warmth of the moment like a blade through silk. The shift was instant and undeniable. "You're here to talk about your foundation work," she continued, her gaze now fixed firmly on him. "But I have to ask, don't you think it's a bit convenient how you always seem to show up right when you need public sympathy?" The words landed heavily, hanging in the air like a grenade that had not yet exploded. The studio fell completely silent. The applause, the smiles, the energy from moments before vanished as if someone had flipped a switch. Audience members who had been leaning forward in anticipation now sat frozen, unsure whether they had heard correctly. A ripple of discomfort passed through the room. The other hosts stiffened in their seats, shock written plainly across their faces. For just a second, only a second, Michael's smile faltered. The cameras caught it, the brief flash of confusion, the flicker of disbelief crossing his features. Then, with the skill of someone who had spent a lifetime in the public eye, he recovered. His posture remained calm. His voice, when he spoke, was still friendly, though now layered with caution. "I'm sorry, Whoopi," he said gently. "I'm not sure I understand what you mean by that." Whoopi leaned forward in her chair. Any remaining ambiguity vanished. Her posture was confrontational now, her expression unyielding. "Come on, Michael," she said. "Every time your career needs a boost, every time you've got something to promote, suddenly, we're all reminded of your condition." She paused, letting the implication sink in. "It's almost like you're using it as a crutch." The temperature in the studio seemed to drop instantly. Several audience members gasped aloud. One person covered their mouth in shock. The co-hosts looked stunned, their expressions a mix of disbelief and discomfort. Joy Behar's smile had disappeared entirely. Sunny Hostin stared straight ahead, her jaw tight. Sarah Haynes shifted uneasily in her seat, as if unsure whether to intervene. Alyssa Farrah Griffin's eyebrows shot up, her eyes widening. Behind the scenes, camera operators exchanged uneasy glances, uncertain whether they should keep rolling or cut away. In the control room, producers were almost certainly scrambling, hands hovering over switches, voices raised in frantic whispers. Was this planned? Was this some kind of provocative segment gone wrong? Or had one of their most trusted hosts just crossed a line in real time? Michael remained still, absorbing the weight of the accusation. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating. What had begun as a routine interview had transformed, in a matter of seconds, into something far more volatile. A moment that would not be forgotten, no matter how it ended, and everyone in that room knew it. This is the story of how Whoopi Goldberg, one of the most celebrated figures in American entertainment, launched an unprovoked verbal assault on Michael J. Fox, a man beloved not only for his acting career, but also for his tireless advocacy for Parkinson's research. The incident shocked an entire nation and revealed something both dark and unsettling about the nature of celebrity, the precarious balance between public perception and personal behavior. and the fragile boundaries of basic human decency. It is a story that continues to resonate because it exposes the raw, unpredictable dynamics that unfold when fame, personal struggle, and live television collide. This is the moment that changed everything for those involved, the interview that spiraled into catastrophe so rapidly that it made headlines around the world, the confrontation that reminded everyone that even the kindest and most respected figures can reach a breaking point, and the day that Whoopi Goldberg herself learned that certain lines, once crossed, can never be uncrossed nor forgotten. The morning began with promise at the View Studios in New York City, a space that for many had become a symbol of lively debate, robust dialogue, and occasionally controlled chaos. Sunlight poured through the iconic, floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out onto Manhattan's bustling streets, casting long, warm beams of gold across the familiar set. The glow brought out the polished sheen of the desk, highlighted the bright colors of the studio's decor, and illuminated the enthusiastic faces of the production crew moving about their tasks with precision and care. Production assistants hustled across the set, adjusting camera angles with meticulous attention, checking microphone levels, and confirming teleprompter scripts. Their actions were rehearsed, the result of hundreds, perhaps thousands, of hours spent preparing for live broadcasts. There was a sense of excitement in the air, a low hum of anticipation that only seemed to grow as the clock ticked closer to showtime. Michael J. Fox was scheduled to appear as a guest, and his presence alone was enough to elevate the energy in the studio. After decades in the public eye, after countless appearances on talk shows, movie sets, and charity events, Michael remained a figure of universal admiration. His decades-long battle with Parkinson's disease had been played out before the public, not as a spectacle, but as a testament to his resilience. His advocacy work and fundraising efforts had touched countless lives, both directly and indirectly. Rarely had a celebrity been met with such unqualified affection. There were no scandals, no whispers of impropriety, just a man who had dedicated himself to doing good, to shining a light on others' struggles, and to giving hope to those who needed it most. His fans were loyal, not just because of his acting career, but because they saw in him a model of perseverance and integrity. As the audience began filing into the studio, the buzz of excitement became almost tangible. People of all ages, from various walks of life, found their seats with eager anticipation. Many had grown up watching his early sitcoms, following him through the blockbuster films of the 1980s and 1990s, and into his later years as an advocate, speaker, and author. Some were personally affected by Parkinson's disease, whether living with the diagnosis themselves or supporting a family member or friend through its progression. They were here for encouragement, for a sense of connection to someone who could understand their struggles, and for the hope that comes from hearing stories of breakthroughs and resilience. The makeup artists worked backstage with practiced precision, brushing powder across faces, adjusting hair, and offering words of reassurance. Meanwhile, Michael reviewed his talking points with his publicist, a quiet smile on his lips, mentally rehearsing his stories, his jokes, his moments of inspiration. The topics he intended to cover were familiar yet deeply important: the latest initiatives of his foundation, advancements in Parkinson's research, the impact of newly developed therapies on patients' lives, and the personal stories that reminded him why his work mattered so profoundly. For him, these interviews were never just about promotion. They were about awareness, compassion, and human connection. It was the kind of interview he had conducted countless times before, and yet, each time, he approached it with the same grace, the same patience, and the same blend of humor and optimism that had become his hallmark. But what neither Michael nor anyone else in the studio knew was that Whoopi Goldberg had arrived that morning in a mood that could only be described as peculiar, even ominous. Those who had worked closely with her for years might have picked up on the subtle signs: the rigid set of her jaw, the sharp intensity in her eyes, the way her fingers drummed lightly against her notes with barely restrained impatience. The usual warmth that accompanied her interactions seemed muted, replaced by something colder, more calculated. Yet for the production team, the audience, and even her fellow co-hosts, These were small enough cues to be dismissed as pre-show jitters, focus, or perhaps a personal concern that had nothing to do with the day's programming. After all, The View was no stranger to tension. Passionate debates and pointed questions were embedded in the show's DNA. A little edge, a little friction was expected. When Michael finally entered the studio, the atmosphere shifted immediately. Applause erupted, a mixture of genuine excitement and long-standing admiration for the actor. Michael moved carefully but confidently across the set, his smile radiant, his wave to the audience effortless. The subtle tremors that Parkinson's had introduced into his movements were there, acknowledged and unhidden, yet they seemed almost to humanize him further, a visual testament to the authenticity and courage that his fans had always admired. It was a familiar scene, one he had experienced countless times, and yet it always carried a weight, a reminder that every public appearance required careful navigation. The other co-hosts rose as he approached, offering warm greetings and handshakes. Joy Bihar's smile was genuine, her handshake firm and welcoming. Sunny Hostin beamed with the enthusiasm of someone delighted to see a friend. Sarah Haynes's face lit up in recognition and genuine pleasure. Alyssa Farah Griffin nodded, eyes sparkling with excitement. For a brief moment, the scene seemed to encapsulate everything comforting and positive about live television. Everyone seemed happy to have Michael on the show. Everyone except Whoopi Goldberg. She barely lifted her gaze from her notes as he took his seat in the guest chair, offering the briefest of nods, almost imperceptible. The other hosts exchanged quick glances, subtle but charged with meaning. Something was off. Those who knew Whoopi well recognized the difference immediately. This was not her usual pre-interview focus, nor was it simple distraction or fatigue. It was something colder, more deliberate, a tension that hinted at confrontation. Michael, adjusting his microphone, remained composed, his smile intact, still engaging with the audience, seemingly unaware that an invisible trap had already been laid. The air shifted, the warmth replaced by a silent, almost tangible anticipation, as the cameras rolled and the studio settled into a precarious calm. It was in that moment, as the audience watched expectantly, that the stage was set for an interview that would defy expectations, a confrontation that would shock viewers, and a day that none of them would soon forget.